Between 1930 and 1940, more than 400 mafia-related murders ripped through the streets of Brooklyn, Cleveland, Detroit, and a dozen other American cities. Most of the victims were gangsters, informants, or union organizers who had crossed the wrong people. But here's the chilling part. Almost none of these killings were committed out of passion, revenge, or territory. They were jobs carried out by a crew of young men who treated murder the way most people treated a paycheck. This was Murder Incorporated, the enforcement arm of the Mafia, a mixed crew of Jewish and Italian killers who answered not to one Mafia family, but to the Commission itself. When Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, or Lepke Buchalter needed someone eliminated quietly, efficiently, permanently, they called these men, and the man they called most often was a 20-some from Brownsville, Brooklyn, who dressed like a movie star and killed with the cold precision of a surgeon. His name was Harry Strauss. The newspapers called him Pittsburgh Phil. His friends called him Pep. His victims, if they had time to realize what was happening, called him nothing at all. He was linked to at least 100 murders. Some accounts put the number closer to 500. He used ice picks, ropes, hammers, fire extinguishers, whatever was at hand. He once told a fellow killer that his favorite part of his job was reading the newspaper the next morning and learning that his work had made the coroner vomit. How did a Jewish immigrant kid from a Brownsville tenement become the deadliest contract killer in American history? How did murdering operate in plain sight for nearly a decade? And why, when the law finally closed in, did the most feared hitman in New York City walk calmly into the electric chair without a fight? Once they send Pittsburgh Phil for you, your fate is sealed. This is the story of the many murders of Pittsburgh Phil, the Mafia's most prolific killer. Harry Pittsburgh Phil Strauss was born Harry Ostrovsky on July the 28th, 1909, in the city of Berdichev in present-day Ukraine, but was back at the time of Harry's birth part of the Russian Empire. His parents, of whom no photographs survive, were Jacob and Edith Ostrovsky, a Jewish couple trying to raise a family in a place where their very identity as Jews put a target on their backs. Harry was the youngest of 4 children, and on paper, he was just another child born into a working-class Jewish household. In reality, he was born into a world already shaped by fear, violence, and discrimination. By the time Harry's parents were born in the 1880s, Berdichev had become one of the largest Jewish population centers in the Russian Empire. It was a crowded, intensely Jewish city, where Jewish families filled the markets, workshops, and small businesses, and where daily life revolved around communal institutions that had existed for generations. Berdichev was often referred to as the Jerusalem of Volhynia. Volhynia being a huge historic region in Eastern Europe, and Berdichev being a city defined by the scale and density of its Jewish life. But that vibrancy existed alongside a constant sense of vulnerability. In the Russian Empire in the early 20th century, Jews were tolerated rather than accepted. Russian rulers inherited centuries-old religious prejudice from the Orthodox Church, which cast Jews as permanent outsiders. That suspicion was formalized in law. Most Jews were restricted to living within a vast border region in the empire's west, an area known as the Pale of Settlement, and were barred from settling freely elsewhere. For families like the Ostrovskys, life inside the Pale meant permanent limitation. Jews faced restrictions on where they could live, what professions they could enter, and how they could educate their children. Economic pressure was constant, but worse was the knowledge that legal protection was fragile at best. Violence could arrive without warning. Organized attacks on Jewish neighborhoods known as pogroms had already swept through towns across the region by the time that Jacob and Edith had reached adulthood. Homes were looted, synagogues destroyed, and families beaten or killed, often with little or no intervention from authorities. By the early 20th century, those outbreaks were becoming more frequent and more brutal. Each political crisis, each rumor of war or economic downturn carried with it the risk that Jewish communities would once again be singled out. Life in places like Berdichev grew increasingly precarious, defined by uncertainty rather than stability. By the time Harry was 5 years old in 1914, with the First World War just beginning and persecution worsening, the message to Jews like the Ostrovskys was unmistakable. Stay in Berdichev and risk your life, or leave, and you might have a chance at survival. They chose to leave, joining the more than 2 million Jews who fled the Russian Empire at the turn of the 20th century. Some went to Western Europe, Palestine, and South America. The majority, however, aimed for America, where approximately 1.5 million arrived. Families packed on to trains heading west to major ports like Hamburg, Bremen, Anser, and Rotterdam. From there they boarded steamships bound for the Atlantic crossing, crammed into steerage compartments where conditions were crowded and unsanitary. Food was basic, privacy was non-existent, and disease spread quickly among families already weakened by the journey. After weeks at sea, the first sign of America finally appeared on the horizon, the Statue of Liberty. Unlike millions of immigrants before them, the Ostrovskys stood on deck and watched her rise from the mist, a towering promise that life might be better than the one they had fled. For a moment, their hearts filled with hope. But for most newcomers, that hope was short-lived. Every immigrant ship was funneled to Ellis Island, the federal processing center that handled more than 12 million arrivals. And it was not a place of welcome. It was a place of examination. Families were herded into cavernous halls beneath harsh lights, subjected to rapid-fire medical inspections, legal interrogations, and hours, sometimes days, of waiting. Doctors marked the sick with chalk on their coats. Those who failed basic health checks were pulled aside, detained, or separated from their families. A small number were sent back across the ocean entirely. For the rest, Ellis Island was their first lesson in America. The journey wasn't over. The struggle had only shifted locations. For most Jewish immigrants, New York was both the destination and the prison. Too poor to travel inland, they remained in the city. Jewish neighborhoods formed across the Lower East Side of Manhattan, Brownsville and Williamsburg in Brooklyn, and parts of Harlem, becoming tight-knit Yiddish-speaking enclaves. Within them, residents built synagogues, newspapers, unions, and mutual aid societies. Fragile safety nets in a city that did not care whether they sank or survived. When the Ostrovskys arrived, they did what many immigrants did. They changed their name to fit in. Ostrovsky became Strauss. It didn't erase their past, but it made life a little easier on forms, at factories, and with landlords. Like many Jewish families at the time, they settled in the Bronx, moving into a modest apartment at 1364 Brook Avenue. Harry's father, Jacob, found steady work as a harness maker at a warehouse on St. Anne's Avenue, a short walk from the family home. Documents like the Ostrovsky census always existed, but accessing them once required time, effort, and physical presence. That barrier is now gone. Today, that anonymity is almost impossible, and speaking to you from here, letting you have a peek behind the curtain, I know that better than most, because everything we do online leaves a footprint. And that's why I personally use today's sponsor, Private Internet Access. I started using PIA simply because the amount of research I do for these documentaries, whilst on the move, using public Wi-Fi, hotel networks, uploading large files, logging into my 20 different Ancestry and New York Times accounts, and I wanted something reliable that I didn't have to think about. Once it's on, it's on. And more than once, it has saved me from sketchy websites when I'm cross-referencing my facts. Private Internet Access is a VPN, which means that it encrypts your internet connection and hides your IP address, protecting your data from hackers, internet providers, and anyone else tracking what you're doing online. They have a strict no-logs policy that's been proven in court, servers in over 90 countries, and all 50 U.S. states, and you can protect an unlimited number of devices with just one subscription. It also lets you access region-restricted content. So, for example, a lot of classic crime and mafia documentaries are available on U.S. Netflix, but not anywhere else. With PIA, you can simply switch your location to the U.S. and watch them as if you were there. Right now, You can get private internet access for just $2.30 a month, plus 4 extra months by using my link, .eavpn.com, The Last Supper. There's also a 30-day money-back guarantee, meaning you can try it right now for a month, completely risk-free, and I couldn't recommend it enough. But now, let's get back to the many murders of Pittsburgh Phil. The Brook Avenue neighborhood was not wealthy, but compared to what the family had known in Berdychev, it represented a step up. The buildings were newer, the streets slightly wider, and the overcrowding less extreme than in many downtown tenements. For a brief period, it appeared they had done what they set out to do: escape the worst of the old world and carve out something better in the new. Then, in 1916, it all collapsed. On November the 28th, 1916, Harry's father, Jacob, was involved in an industrial accident at work. He was rushed to Lebanon Hospital in the Bronx, but the injuries were too severe and he died there. Edith was left a widow with several children to feed in a country that offered no safety net and no one to fall back on. And Harry, the youngest, was just 7 years old. But tragedy did not stop there, because 2 years later, Harry's brother, Hyman, died at Mount C Hospital at the age of 16. The exact cause was never clearly recorded, but the consequences were clear enough. Another devastating loss, another fracture in a family already struggling to survive. Still reeling from Hyman's death, and now without Jacob's income, the family could no longer afford to remain on Brook Avenue. Rent still had to be paid. Food still had to be put on the table. With no safety net to fall back on, Edith was forced to make a decision, and like countless immigrant mothers before her, she chose the only option within reach. So she decided to move the family 20 miles south from the Bronx to Brownsville, settling at 574 Vermont Street, a modest working-class row house just off Livonia Avenue, tucked inside. And to say that Brownsville was a whole different world would be an understatement. By the time that the Strausses finally arrived, Brownsville was one of the most overcrowded and poorest neighborhoods in New York City. Tenement buildings were old, badly maintained, and crammed full of families. Hallways were narrow and dark. Ventilation was poor. And in summer, apartments turned into ovens. In winter, they were freezing. Compared to the newer 5- and 6-story buildings around Brook Avenue, Brownsville was a step down in almost every way. But it was cheap, and that was all that mattered. On the streets, another reality waited. Like many poor immigrant neighborhoods at the time, Brownsville had a thriving street culture, and a lot of it revolved around gangs. Groups of teenage boys formed loose crews for protection, for petty theft, for control of corners, and for pushcart routes. Shopkeepers dealt with constant harassment, theft, and demands for money. Police presence was thin and often corrupt. For kids, the streets were both a playground and a battleground. Fights were common. Rivalries formed quickly. Small-time hustles like stealing, running errands for older criminals, acting as lookouts, they all became part of daily life. School, when it was attended at all, competed with the pull of the streets. And this was the world that shaped young Harry. He had come from a family that had escaped one kind of violence in Europe, only to be dropped into a different kind in New York. The combination of a fatherless home, crushing poverty, and a neighborhood where toughness was the currency, did what it often did in places like Brownsville. It pushed boys toward the only structure that seemed to offer power, money, and a kind of respect: the gangs. Harry's mother managed to find work as a finisher in the garment industry. She was employed at Pull Deldman at 158 West 29th Street in Manhattan, far from Brownsville, deep in the Midtown garment district. The commute was long, the hours even longer, and it meant that Harry spent much of his childhood left to fend for himself. With his father and brother gone, Harry saw firsthand what survival meant: long hours, low pay, and no guarantees. Watching his mother struggle to hold the family together, he came to believe early on that his future wasn't going to follow the ordinary path laid out for boys like him. Regardless, though, for now, he obeyed his mother's wishes, and followed his remaining siblings into enrolling at the massive public school 109, a hulking building that once spanned an entire block on Dumont Avenue. The school is now long gone, replaced by the Van Dyke houses. But in its day, it was one of the most overcrowded public schools in Brooklyn. Built in 1907 to accommodate the flood of Jewish immigrants pouring into the neighborhood, PS 109 was a direct response to a population boom that saw Brownsville's Jewish community swell from 10,000 in 1904 to over 60,000 by the time that 9-year-old Harry enrolled in 1918. And it was within those crowded halls of PS 109 that Harry would meet the boys who would one day grow up to become the most feared band of killers in New York City. Among the boys he met were 2 older kids, who also lived off Livonia Avenue and often walked home with him, Abe Reles and Martin Bugsy Goldstein, nicknamed for being crazy as a bedbug. Both were Brooklyn-born, both drawn to the same thrill of rebellion and ambition that Harry also carried with him. They became fast companions in and out of class, bunking off school, running errands, loitering on corners, and dreaming of a life bigger than what the tenements had to offer. Textbooks never stood a chance. Teachers remembered Harry as sharp-eyed and intelligent, a boy who clearly had ability but little patience for the classroom. He rarely applied himself, often distracted, restless, and uninterested in lessons that felt disconnected from the world waiting for him outside. By his early teens, the pull of the streets was already stronger than the dull routine of school. The neighborhood offered fast money, older role models, and a sense of belonging that textbooks never could. In 1924, at the age of 14, Harry Strauss followed Abe, Bugsy, and dropped out of PS 109 for good. Finally giving in to the law of the streets of Brownsville, Harry started the way that most young criminals did, as a small-time thief. Along with Abe and Bugsy, Harry fell in with the Brownsville Boys, one of the neighborhood's most notorious juvenile gangs. Their endeavors were petty, lifting from pushcarts, picking pockets, running errands for the older gangsters who ran the local rackets. But for boys like them, it wasn't just mischief. It was a doorway, the first step into a darker, wider world that they were destined to thrive in. But little did they know that the Brownsville Boys weren't just another gang. They were a pipeline, a street-hardened finishing school for organized crime. Among their ranks were teens, with names that would soon echo across the underworld. Albert Tannenbaum, Seymour Magoon, and Mendy Weiss. They were already running rackets, collecting money, and walking the neighborhood with a confidence that came from knowing who was afraid of them. For Harry, Abe, and Bugsy, these weren't just older kids. They were proof that if you were tough enough, smart enough, and cruel enough, you could claw your way out of the tenements and row houses and take exactly what it was that you wanted. Most of Harry's friends called him Pep, short for Pepper, which was early 20th slang for someone hot-tempered and quick to react, like the spice itself. But with the money he made running jobs with the Brownsville Boys, Harry started dressing like he had something to prove, and soon picked up a new nickname. Whilst the other boys spent their money on liquor, gambling, and whatever pleasures the street had to offer, Harry spent his on tailored suits, polished shoes, and crisp collars, the sharpest look that a street kid could buy. And that's when Pittsburgh Phil started to stick. Not because he'd ever been to Pittsburgh, but because he reminded people of the famous 19th century gambler, slick, stylish, and always looking for the next score. Harry understood that image mattered. With the way that he dressed, Harry made sure that you remembered him, and people did. He was tall, handsome, and moved with the kind of confidence that turned heads in Brownsville. He quickly gained a reputation as a womanizer long before he gained any other, but that wasn't what history would remember him for. In the years that followed, the petty thief from Brownsville, the sharp dresser, the charmer, the boy whose teachers had once thought he had potential, would carve out a far darker place for himself. He would become known not for fashion or for flirtation, but for something that stunned even the hardest criminals in New York, a chilling, emotionless talent for murder. And history was about to hand him the perfect stage. On January the 20th, 1920, America tried something bold, and in hindsight, something disastrous. World War I is over, and so are America's days of legal alcoholic drink. Convinced self-sacrifice and sobriety will bring prosperity and peace as it won victory in war. Americans praise passing of the dry law. With the passage of a law called the Volstead Act, the United States officially banned the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol. It was the beginning of Prohibition, a nationwide effort to stamp out drinking in hopes of creating a cleaner, safer society. But the plan backfired almost immediately. People didn't stop drinking. They just stopped doing it legally. Almost overnight, a black market was born. And in cities like New York, bars went underground and became secret clubs, now called speakeasies. Trucks that once used to deliver ice, milk, and other essentials now moved illegal booze. And gangs that had once scraped by on pickpocketing and protection rackets suddenly found themselves at the center of a booming, dangerous, and incredibly profitable new business. When Prohibition began, the Brownsville boys went to work for the men who already controlled the neighborhood's criminal economy. The Shapiro brothers of Brooklyn, Mia, Irving, and Willie. They were three ruthless Jewish siblings, sons of Russian Jewish immigrants, whose path to America closely mirrored Harry's own. Like the Ostrovskys, their parents had fled the Russian Empire in 1905 and arrived in Brooklyn just a few months later in East New York, a Brooklyn district bordering Brownsville and sharing its dense Jewish immigrant streets. The family settled into a modest house at 691 Blake Avenue had become the headquarters of their expanding rackets. By then, the Shapiro were deeply entrenched in bootlegging, illegal gambling, labor racketeering, truck hijacking, and protection schemes across Brownsville and East New York. They controlled liquor storage, delivery routes, speakeasies, trucking crews, and gambling dens. Nothing moved through their territory without their approval. Prohibition had handed organized crime the opportunity of a lifetime. The liquor trade was booming, the money was flowing, and the Shapiro needed help. Their growing empire demanded more muscle, loyal young enforcers who knew the streets and could follow orders. In early 1924, they found what they were looking for in the Brownsville boys. The boys were exactly the kind of tough, ambitious foot soldiers the brothers needed to protect shipments, settle disputes, and keep their rivals in line. The Brownsville boys blended into that structure the way the young street crews always did at the bottom. They guarded trucks, moved stolen liquor, collected small debts, stole shipments, and enforced orders when needed. It was dangerous work, but it paid better than factory wages and came with the protection of men whose names carried weight on the street. Now working full-time in the Shapiro's rackets, Abe Reles eventually got pinched while carrying out a theft job and was sentenced to 2 years at Sing Sing prison. The first real taste of prison for any of the Brownsville boys, and a sobering reminder of the risks that came with their rising status. While Reles served his sentence, the rest of the crew kept working for the Shapiro, running liquor to speakeasies, shaking down local shops, and enforcing street-level rackets. Speakeasies were illegal bars hidden behind storefronts, barber shops, or basement where flappers danced, jazz plays, and bootleg liquor flowed freely. They were the beating heart of Prohibition nightlife, and for crews like the Brownsville boys, they were also opportunity. When Reles got out in 1926, he rejoined Bugsy, Goldstein, and Harry with a new plan. Since they were already making regular booze drop-offs, they started delivering something else. Slot machines. Quietly and quickly, they built an off-the-book gambling racket, placing machines in the very speakeasies that they were supplying the Shapiro brothers' booze to, then collecting the cash on return runs. The operation grew fast, too fast. The money rolled in, but so did the risk. They were collecting profits on Shapiro turf without Shapiro approval. And in that world, that kind of trespass didn't just earn you a warning, it earned you a funeral. But the Brownsville boys weren't alone anymore because, behind the scenes, they had made a new and dangerous connection, one that would change everything. The boys were making real money, and that attracted the man they called the accountant of the mob, Meyer Lansky. Already one of the most powerful mobsters in New York City, the right hand of rising star Lucky Luciano. Lansky wasn't a street gangster. He was a strategist and a money man, quietly building a syndicate-wide network of gambling operations alongside liquor-smuggling rackets. What he wanted was access to the poorer neighborhoods of Brooklyn, where slot machines, policy games, and underground gambling flourished among people desperate for quick money. Lansky saw potential in the Brownsville boys and financed them with his bootlegging millions to expand further, but he took a cut. As Lansky's influence expanded into Brownsville, East New York, and Ocean Hill, so did their confidence. With Lansky and by extension Lucky Luciano backing them, the Brownsville boys now felt protected from immediate retaliation. With that protection in place, the Brownsville boys grew bolder. They continued placing slot machines deeper into Shapiro-controlled blocks, openly skimming profits that once flowed upwards to the brothers. And just as importantly, they began expanding beyond slots. From gambling, they moved into loan sharking, crap games, and labor racketeering, using intimidation and violence to enforce payments and control workers. What began as petty theft had now evolved into organized crime. They were no longer just street kids running errands. They were building a criminal operation of their own, one powerful enough to challenge the men who once owned them. With money now flowing and protection behind them, the crew needed more than thieves and collectors. They needed men who could enforce their will without hesitation, men who could kill if necessary. The Brownsville boys' ranks swelled, and boy, did they start killing. They began to gather a reputation for ruthlessness. During their rise up the criminal underworld, transitioning from working under the Shapiro to working for Lansky, they ran into plenty of adversaries. Sometimes it was a speakeasy owner who wouldn't let them install a slot machine. Other times it was a loan sharking client who borrowed money but couldn't pay it back. And occasionally the call came straight from Meyer Lansky himself, asking for a favor. The fact that the New York Mafia would turn to a crew of 20 and 21-year-olds for contract killings said everything about how effective and feared they'd now become. By 1928, 22-year-old Abe Reles had already killed approximately 6 men. He was the only one who'd done serious jail time, and he was the oldest of the crew. Reles was the natural leader, the one who spoke to Lansky and his top men, and who oversaw their most serious work. He particularly enjoyed using a length of rope to garrote his victims, a method that earned him the nickname Kid Twist, a name shared with an earlier New York gangster, Max Verbach, who was also known for killing his victims with a rope. But all of the Brownsville boys were stone-cold killers by the time that they were barely out of their teens. Bugsy Goldstein was another formidable assassin, the one most often dispatched when Lansky needed someone eliminated. Living up to his nickname, Bugsy liked to crack jokes before pulling the trigger, often saying things like, "You need me," like a hole in the head just before putting a bullet in his target's skull. Albert Tannenbaum was also cut from the same cloth. Like Bugsy, he handled high-level hits for Lansky and earned the nickname Tick-Tock after completing one mob hit just 10 minutes after getting the call. Mendy Weiss and Seymour McCoon looked after the loan sharking side of the business. Mendy was one of Lansky's most trusted men and was frequently deployed in labor racketeering operations. McGoon, meanwhile, was known as Blue Jaw because his stubble was so thick it looked like he needed another shave 5 minutes after the first. The other Brownsville boys mocked him for it, most of them too young to grow proper facial hair. But out of all of them, Harry, by now widely known as Pittsburgh Phil, not just within his own crew, but across much of Brooklyn, had already begun to stand apart. Harry was more than just an assassin. He was a professional, and he enjoyed it. As time went by, his skills became so known and respected in the underworld that he did hits all across the country. Despite getting arrested a couple of times, he managed to avoid prison every single time. The reason for Harry's successful avoidance of conviction was simple. He had a strict personal rule. He never carried a gun, period. And he never carried a weapon unless he was about to use it. For the vast majority of killings, Harry used whatever was immediately available in his vicinity: a length of pipe, heavy chain torn from a bicycle, even a fire extinguisher on one occasion. If cops found him, he made sure no evidence was on him or around him. But above all the listed weapons, Harry's preferred weapon was the ice pick. In the years before refrigeration, the ice pick was a common household tool used daily to break down blocks of ice, and it drew little attention if carried or discarded. Contemporary investigators and later law enforcement sources acknowledge that Strauss used the ice pick with such precision, a surgical strike to the brain, that some of his victims were initially ruled to have died of natural causes like brain hemorrhages. At a time when forensic medicine was limited and post-mortem examinations were often brief and inconsistent, those deaths passed without immediate suspicion. One of the reasons Harry was able to kill repeatedly without conviction. By the early 1930s, a combination of events finally gave Harry Strauss the platform to do what he did best and set him on the path to becoming one of the most prolific contract killers the American underworld would ever produce. The friction between the Brownsville boys and the Shapiro brothers was slowly turning into open war. The Shapiro, despite still owning a lot of territory across Brooklyn, saw the crew that once worked under them now surpassing them, and the brothers felt that they should be getting a cut of the money that the mob were now getting from the boys' rackets. The Shapiro also understood that the boys were no longer street-level thieves. They were becoming the operational core of a rival organization, and if they weren't eliminated, they would eventually take everything. Despite the Brownsville boys being protected by Meyer Lansky himself, the Shapiro decided to go on the offensive, thinking they could take them out, and thus a war for Brownsville began. Both sides began trading shootings over gambling routes, extortion lines, and control of Brownsville. During the early phase of the war, Reles and Bugsy were lured into what they believed was a routine meeting inside Shapiro-controlled territory. But it was a setup. Shapiro gunmen opened fire at close range, riddling both men with bullets. By sheer luck, Reles and Goldstein were wounded, but survived, managing to escape with their lives. From that moment on, the war shifted from business to extermination. But the Brownsville boys were not the only enemies that the Shapiro had made in their push to consolidate gambling territory and control trucking routes. The brothers had also crossed the path of a far more dangerous opponent, Louis Lepke Buchalter. By this point, Lepke was no street gangster. By the early 1930s, he was already one of the most powerful racketeers in New York, controlling huge sections of the garment industry, trucking unions, bakeries, and factory labor contracts. While the Shapiro ran bootlegging, gambling, and street rackets in Brownsville and East New York, Lepke controlled entire industries. And when the Shapiro began interfering with trucking operations and labor crews tied to his rackets, they crossed a line he didn't tolerate. To Lepke, this wasn't competition. It was a direct threat to his business. He made a decision. The Shapiro brothers had to be removed, and their removal had to send a message. Lepke quietly put out bounties on all three Shapiro brothers in March of 1931, $10,000 each, around $250,000 in today's money, and a small fortune in the midst of the Great Depression. The Brownsville boys didn't hesitate. After being ambushed and shot, they were already committed to killing the brothers. But one additional incident made the contract deeply personal. During another gambling-related dispute, Irving Shapiro sexually assaulted Abe Reles' girlfriend, Rosie Kirsch, of whom no photographs have survived. Whatever restraint had existed before was gone, and for Kid Twist, the war was now a vendetta. The bounty on the Shapiro brothers' heads brought new players into the fold. From nearby Ocean Hill came another crew, the Ocean Hill Hooligans, an Italian street outfit led by Harry Happy Mahan and his close friend and protege, Frank the Dasher Abendundo. Like the Brownsville boys, the Hooligans were a tight-knit gang of about 10 men, and just as lethal. Mayhan, whose face bore a permanent scowl, earned his nickname from the cruel irony of it. Abendundo got his for a very different reason. He was known to sprint away from crime scenes, hysterically laughing. They weren't brought in to reinforce the Brownsville boys. They came chasing the same prize. With bounties hanging over the Shapiro's heads, the two crews aligned, and the hunt intensified. The first to fall was Irving Shapiro. In July 1931, he was beaten and then shot to death by Harry and Abe. Inside the Shapiro family home and headquarters at 691 Blake Avenue in Brooklyn, aged 27, Maya Shapiro survived a full 20 assassination attempts before Reles's crew targeted his brother Irving. Finally, on September the 17th, 1931, acting on a tip-off, Reles, with the help of Harry and Bugsy, abducted Mia from a Manhattan speakeasy before executing him in a Lower East Side basement. Reles himself fired the fatal bullet. After two of the brothers were killed, the Shapiro's empire quickly crumbled, and the Brownsville boys were the new bosses in town. However, the final and most chilling act came 3 years later. On July the 20th, 1934, the last surviving brother, Willie Shapiro, was located after years on the run. At around 3:00 p.m., Willie was abducted as he left his safe house at 1845 Sterling Place in Ocean Hill by Pittsburgh Phil, Harry Mohn, and Frank Abendondo, and taken to a safe house where he was brutally tortured. His skull, jaw, and wrists were broken, and his body was covered in bruises. Harry tied a cord around his throat, hands, and feet, and bound him in a sitting position so that any knee action or movement meant that he would have strangled himself to death. Then they put him in a burlap sack and took him to an abandoned sand pit in the marshes of Carnegie, about 100 feet from Fresh Creek Nature Preserve, between Flatlands and Conklin Avenues, far from the eyes of the city where Harry Reles. And Bugsy buried him alive whilst he was still breathing. And with that, it's safe to say the Shapiro organization was erased. For Lepke Buchalter, the message was impossible to ignore. The men responsible for wiping out the Shapiro brothers hadn't acted recklessly. They had worked methodically, patiently, and without mercy. They had taken on a powerful Brooklyn outfit and destroyed it completely. And most importantly, they had done exactly what Lepke had done. This was the moment Lepke recognized the value of the Brownsville boys, not as street thugs, but as a disciplined extermination squad. And for Harry, it marked the beginning of a new phase of his life. Killing not for territory, but for contract. The crew from Brownsville had proven something rare. They could eliminate an entire organization without chaos, without hesitation, and without leaving unfinished business behind. What began as a street war had revealed something far more dangerous, a dedicated killing force, a tool that could serve the highest levels of organized crime. And that's exactly what Lepke and the criminal syndicate he represented was searching for. Professional killers on retainer who could be called upon any time to carry out mob hits on behalf of the families. That force would come to be known as Murder Incorporated, and Harry was set to become its most lethal weapon. By the early 1930s, the vast profits generated during Prohibition had catapulted the American Mafia into a level of influence and power that it had never seen before. In cities like New York, Chicago, and Cleveland, the Italian Mafia controlled bootlegging, gambling, loan sharking, prostitution, labor unions, trucking, and the docks. Running alongside them were powerful Jewish gangs, especially in New York, who dominated gambling, garment rackets, and enforcement. Together they formed what became known as the National Crime Syndicate, a loose but very real partnership between Italian and Jewish organized crime. The turning point came in 1931 after the bloody Castellamores War, when the dust settled. Lucky Luciano emerged as the most forward-thinking mafia leader in New York City. He understood that endless turf wars were bad for business, and in response he helped create the Commission, a kind of national board of directors for the Mafia and for the National Crime Syndicate. The Commission included the bosses of New York's 5 Mafia families, plus other heads of criminal factions like the aforementioned Lepke and key figures from other major cities. Its job was to settle disputes, divide territory, and approve major hits so that no one family could drag everyone into a war over personal grudges, which is exactly what started the Castella War. But there was a problem. Even with the commission in place, decisions still had to be enforced. When the commission agreed that someone had to go, be it a rival boss, a suspected informant, a stubborn union leader, or a troublesome politician, the bosses didn't want those murders traced back to their own soldiers. Using family hitmen created too many links, too many witnesses, and too much risk if anyone talked. They needed distance between the people giving the orders and the people doing the killing. And that's where Louis Lepke came in. Lepke now had something few bosses in New York possessed, a crew of young, fearless killers who had just proven themselves by wiping out the Shapiro. Word of their efficiency spread quickly as the commission met and negotiated the future of organized crime. One thing became clear: if they wanted to prevent another all-out gang war, then they needed a reliable team. Men who could quietly remove problems before they became conflicts with Lepke and Lansky, now vouching for them. That role fell to the Brownsville boys. But they weren't alone. The two hitters from Ocean Hill, Happy Mian and Frank Abundando, had also caught the syndicate's attention. They fell under the wing of a man who controlled Brooklyn's docks and one of the most feared figures in New York City, Albert Anastasia. A man who was also known by another name, the Lord High Executioner. Anastasia ruled the waterfront unions and dockside rackets, enforcing his authority with open violence and absolute silence. Where Lepke ran labor like a business, Anastasia ruled like a warlord. Men disappeared. Bodies surfaced in the river. No one talked. Among Italian mobsters, he was the man you called when someone needed to be removed permanently. Together, Lepke and Anastasia began shaping a new idea, a centralized killing crew that would work not for one family, but for them all. The structure followed the ethnic lines of the underworld, with Lepke overseeing the Jewish killers, many of them from Brownsville and the Lower East Side, and Anastasia overseeing the Italian hitmen, mostly from Brooklyn neighborhoods like Ocean Hill and East New York. These guys didn't claim territory. They didn't run neighborhoods. Their job was simpler and darker. Take contracts from the top and make people disappear. From this arrangement, the syndicate's enforcement arm was born. A mixed crew of Jewish and Italian killers who answered not to one boss or one family, but to the higher interests of organized crime itself. The Italian members of the group were to report to Anastasia and the Jewish mobsters to Lepke on the streets. They would soon be known by a name that said it all: Murder Incorporated. To bolster the ranks of Murder Incorporated, other hitmen were added to their ranks from the Commission's networks. One of these was Whitey Krakow, real name Walter Krakoa, who was already known as a dependable gunman who did his work without questions. He was also the brother of Esther Krakoa, who was married to none other than Bugsy Siegel, Mafia Hitman, childhood friend of both Lansky and Luciano, and one of the most feared men not just in New York City, but across the nation. Their ranks swelled further with hardened street killers like Charles the Bug Workman, nicknamed like Bugsy Goldstein for his jittery, unpredictable nature; Louis Pretty Amber, better known for his cruelty than his looks; and Skolin Bernstein, a shifty killer and prolific car thief whose main task would be providing stolen getaway cars for the hits. Also joining them were Vito Chickenhead Garino, a volatile strong-arm from East New York, whose nickname was earned from his habit to shoot live chickens to practice his marksmanship; Walter Sage, a trusted gambling operative who doubled as a quiet but efficient executioner; Juke Mafiore, a seasoned Brownsville enforcer; and finally Irving Gangi Cohen, a streetwise gunman whose steady nerve made him valuable on high-risk assignments. Murdering boasted around 40 members, and these men were the most notable. They were the muscle, the enforcers who would carry out the syndicate's darkest work. But among all of them, one man stood apart. Harry would become the linchpin of the group. He was a cold, efficient killer, but also an outright psychopath. He would later be linked to at least 100 murders, with some account placing the number around the 500 mark. And unlike most of the others, Strauss didn't kill just because he was ordered to. He actually enjoyed it. He reportedly took special pleasure in reading the newspapers the next morning after a hit and learning that his work had made the coroner vomit. His savage, emotionless method soon became legendary, and before long both Lepke and Anastasia would be assigning contracts to Harry personally, bypassing the Abeles and Murder Incorporated's usual chain of command. Once the crews linked up, the street gang mentality faded. To them, murder became simply work, something done with efficiency, speed, and a strange sense of pride. They were paid a regular salary of $3,000 a week as a retainer, equivalent to $72,000 in today's currency. With additional financial support provided to their families, they even needed an office, and they found it in a small Brownsville candy store called Midnight Roses, located at the corner of Saratoga and Livonia Avenue, right in the heart of the neighborhood where Abe, Bugsy, and Harry had grown up. Midnight Roses was run by a woman named Rosie Gold, of whom no photographs have survived, and from the outside it looked harmless. A place selling candy, cigarettes, and newspapers. But behind the counter, and near the payphone, it was something else entirely. Rosie herself ran numbers from the window, which was a kind of illegal lottery popular at the time. And she also operated a small brothel upstairs, serving as both a front and a facilitator. And this was where the orders came in. Lepke's and Anastasia's men would arrive to pass along assignments. Murder Incorporated would sit around playing cards, drinking coffee, and waiting for the phone to ring. And when it rang, someone somewhere was about to die. Anastasia usually sent Louis Capone, no relation to Al. Louis was a loan shark from Coney Island who also ran a legitimate pasticceria, an Italian-style cafe serving coffee and pastry in Ocean Hill. The pasticceria became a popular hangout for Happy, the Dasher, and the rest of the hooligans, and Capone built a rapport with them when they were young by giving them free food. Before long, they were collecting debts on Louis's behalf, which is when they caught the eye of Anastasia, who frequented the pasticceria. But with Anastasia far too busy helping run the mafia and sitting on the commission along with Lucky, Lansky, and Co., he sent Capone on his behalf. And it wasn't long before the contract began coming in thick and fast. In October of 1932, Rocco Morganti, of whom no photos survived, a racketeer in the Painters Union, became the target of a contract killing ordered by Capone. The exact motive was never confirmed, but some believed it was retaliation for a shooting in 1928. Others said that Morganti's grip on a painters' laborers' union had made him an obstacle, one that powerful figures wanted removed. Regardless of the reason, Capone assigned Harry and Reles to do the job. And on October the 16th, Morganti was lured to a friendly poker game in a small third-floor apartment. Outside, Capone waited in a parked car, watching the building entrance while Harry and Reles climbed the narrow staircase leading to the apartment. They burst into the apartment with revolvers already in hand and ordered the men to stand against the wall. A moment later, Harry and Reles released a hail of bullets, striking Morganti multiple times. Within seconds, they were gone, retreating down the stairwell and disappearing into the street where Capone drove them away into the Brooklyn night. The hit was quick, coordinated, and merciless, the first of many whilst operating as Murder Incorporated. In May 1933, another contract came down, this time from Joe Adonis, another powerful mobster who sat on the commission. The target was a small-time associate named John Faria, of whom no photographs have survived, but we know that he'd been skimming profits from Adonis. The job was assigned to Happy Mean, a native of Ocean Hill like Faria, who also knew him personally. That detail made the hit colder by design because trust would be the weapon. On the night of May the 25th, my own chickenhead, Garino, and Harry rolled up in a dark Cadillac, the preferred tool of mob executioners, because it was quiet, powerful, and anonymous in city traffic. Faria climbed into the car without hesitation, unaware that death now sat beside him. As the Cadillac moved through the dim Brooklyn streets, the inside of the car fell silent. No words were exchanged. The timing had already been decided. Then, without warning, the gunfire erupted. Harry and the others fired at point-blank range, the shots muffled by the thick upholstery. Faria slumped forward, dead before the car had traveled another block. To Harry, it was just another clean execution, fast, contained, and without emotion. But even in death, Faria caused one final problem. His hand locked reflexively around the leather door strap, grabbing it so tightly that it wouldn't release. The killers pulled to the curb and tried to pry his fingers open, but they wouldn't budge. They then pushed Faria's body out into the street, still clutching the torn strap as it ripped free from the door frame and landed behind him. The Cadillac pulled away into the night, leaving behind a body that no one would ever admit to seeing where it came from, and an upset Reles because a dead man had gone to the afterlife, still holding a piece of his Cadillac. Later in 1933, a reckless young thief named Red Alpert crossed paths with Harry and sealed his own fate. At just 19 years old, Albert had managed to steal a bootload of valuable gems worth nearly $10,000, which is equivalent to nearly $250,000 in today's currency. A bold score for someone so young. But he had no way to move them safely on the street. Looking for a buyer with real underworld connections, Alpert turned to Harry and offered him the stones for $3,000. Strauss counted with $700. It wasn't a serious negotiation. It was a declaration of control. Alpert refused the offer sharply and without respect. The refusal didn't sit well. Harry returned to Alpert with Reles and Bugsy, again demanding the diamonds for the same insultingly low price. Alpert refused a second time, and this time was even more openly defiant. With Louis Capone's approval, Harry made the decision that followed almost automatically in their world. He cornered Alpert on a yard in Vank Avenue and shot him 3 times in the head. At the time, the killing seemed like just another small, efficient execution in a city already numb to violence. But the murder of Alpert would not disappear as so many others had. On February the 16th, 1934, a rare crack appeared inside the normally disciplined structure of the Brownsville crew. When Reles became involved in a personal dispute with an African-American garage attendant named Charles Battles, of whom no photograph survived. A confrontation between the two men at the garage located at 110 East 98th Street quickly turned violent. Harry and Reles returned that afternoon, and Alvin Snyder, another garage attendant, was stabbed by the duo who thought it was Battles. Snyder collapsed from his wounds, and within hours the underworld was buzzing with confusion and fear. This was not a clean execution. This was an error. Harry, Bugsy, Reles, and Happy were arrested on April the 6th, 1934, and photographed with their weapons in what would become one of the most famous images of the era. They were charged with first-degree murder, and for once, the machinery of murdering had drawn the full attention of law enforcement, and this time the case threatened to expose far more than a single killing. In the end, the charges did not fall evenly. Reles was convicted of the lesser charge of second-degree assault for the stabbing of Battles and sentenced to 3 years in prison. The murder charge against Harry, however, was dismissed for a lack of evidence. And once again, Pittsburgh Phil slipped away cleanly through the hands of the law, and Murder Incorporated had its main man back on the streets. That was crucial, because Murder Incorporated was about to be deployed in full force. It started in September 1935, when Pretty Amber, who had been an early member of the gang and had helped run the rackets in the garment industry for Lepke, recently broke free and attempted to carve out territory of his own with his brother, another member of Murder Incorporated, Joseph. Just like when the Shapiro brothers tried it 4 years ago, this didn't go down well with Lepke at 12:45 p.m. On the 30th of September, Joseph Amberg and his chauffeur Morris Kessler, of whom no photographs survive, were followed into their headquarters, a garage located on the corner of Blake and Christopher Avenue in Brownsville, by Harry the Dasher Dando and Blue Jaw Mag. Amber and Kessler were lined up against the wall and executed coldly, which reminded police at the time of the infamous Street Valentine's Day massacre killing in Chicago 6 years earlier. Pretty Amberg had lost his brother and one of his main crew members, and he went into hiding, perhaps living a little longer than he expected once Pittsburgh Phil was sent for you. And that was because just 3 weeks later, Arthur Fliegenheimer, better known as Dutch Schultz, an unpredictable and violently temperamental mob boss from the Bronx, would meet his end. He was under crushing legal pressure from Special Prosecutor Thomas E. Dewey, who was dismantling Dutch's empire piece by piece. Desperate, Schultz was hell-bent on killing Dewey, convinced it would make his problems disappear. When he brought the idea to the commission under Lucky Luciano, it was flatly rejected. A hit on a prosecutor of Dewey's stature would bring catastrophic heat on every single major crime family. Schultz vowed to proceed anyway, shouting that Dewey would be dead within 48 hours, and that defiance sealed his fate. Lepke assigned Charles the Bug Workman and Emmanuel Mendy Weiss to carry out the job. On October the 23rd, 1935, they entered the Palace Chop House at 12 East Park Street in Newark, New Jersey, where Schultz and his men were dining. Workman and Weiss opened fire, killing 3 of Schultz's top aides, Otto Abadaba Berman, his financial wizard, Abe Landau, his principal bodyguard, and Lulu Rosenrantz, his driver and muscle. They then found Schultz in the men's room and shot him twice with a revolver. Schultz clung to life for nearly 24 hours, finally dying the next day. The Palace Chop House hit would become one of the most infamous executions in organized crime history. But murdering wasn't done there, because the very next day after Dutch Schultz was killed, Pretty Hamburg met the same fate as his brother. On the morning of October the 23rd, 1935, Pretty Amber's body was discovered in the back seat of a burning car across from 131 North Elliott Place in Brooklyn. He'd been stripped of his clothing, his hands bound with wire, a sack placed over his head, and 3 bullets fired into his skull, delivered by Happy Mayone and Harry. A witness who first noticed the fire reported seeing several men fleeing the scene. And for the brutal trail of death that Murder, Inc. would leave, this was just the beginning, because another young man was already drifting towards his own collision with Pittsburgh Phil. Soul Jack Goldstein, of whom no photographs exist, was only 24 years old, but he was already deeply embedded in the rackets of Fulton Fish Market, a criminal gold mine that fed millions of dollars into New York's underworld. And his private life was just as volatile. He became involved with Evelyn Middleman, a woman whose relationships with gangsters had a habit of ending in blood. After Goldstein killed one of her former boyfriends in 1935, he and Evelyn grew close until Harry noticed her. What followed was swift and humiliating. A confrontation in a Brooklyn pool hall ended with Goldstein laid out by a pool cue, and soon after, Harry took Evelyn for himself. On the street, she would become known as the Kiss of Death Girl, due to a habit of her boyfriends being murdered. By the summer of 1936, Goldstein's troubles moved beyond jealousy and grudges. A major investigation into racketeering at the Fulton Fish Market now threatened the empire of Joseph Sachs Lanza, the Genovese power who controlled the union and its massive extortion profits. Goldstein rattled, and talking openly about getting out of the life suddenly became a liability. He knew too much. Lanza made the decision. Louis Capone delivered the orders, and Harry volunteered for the job. At the time that the contract was issued, Goldstein had just remarried and had gone into the mountains around Glen Wild Lake in New Jersey on his honeymoon, unaware that his life had already been signed away. On the morning of August the 3rd, 1936, Anthony Duke Mafuret and Abe Pretty Levine, a new young recruit to Murder Incorporated, lured Goldstein from his cabin under false pretenses. Once inside their car, he was seized and knocked unconscious with a hammer. Following Harry's instructions, they kept him alive just long enough to deliver him. Harry bound him with a clothesline rigged to tighten with movement, wrapped his body in a blanket, and took him out to the lake. There, without ceremony, Goldstein was thrown overboard alive. His body was never recovered. His new bride never reported him missing. And for Harry, the contract was fulfilled, but the satisfaction was deeply personal. The next hit was on a target who was also suspected of talking to the authorities. By 1936, Irving Ashkenaze, a Lithuanian-American cab driver and seasoned ex-con, had been granted parole and was back to the streets. But this time, whispers began to spread that Ashkenazi was talking to the law, quietly feeding information to Special Prosecutor Thomas Dewey about Lepke's grip on Manhattan's labor unions. When Lepke learned that Ashkenazi was suspecting of cooperating with Dewey, the order was immediate. The execution was assigned to Harry, Tick-Tock, Tannenbaum, and Ganji Cohen. On a September night in 1936, they found Ashkenazi seated behind the wheel of his cab outside the Paramount Manor Hotel of Happiness, located near Hurleyville in upstate New York. To anyone watching, it looked like a routine fare pickup. To the hit team, it was a perfectly staged trap. Seconds later, the quiet street exploded with gunfire. Ashkenazi was struck repeatedly and slumped sideways behind the wheel. Detectives at first believed the killer had posed as a passenger. 4 shots appeared to have come from outside the cab and 1 from the passenger side. But the autopsy told a far darker story. 16 wounds were found on the body, including deep stab injuries, a brutal signature often associated with Harry. 5 bullets from 2 different guns confirmed what the street already knew. This was a coordinated execution. To the public, it was another unsolved gangland killing. To the underworld, the message was unmistakable. Informants did not simply die, they were erased. And once again, Harry walked away from the scene, as he always did, unseen, uncharged, and untouched by consequence. But Ashkenazi's death was not an isolated warning. It was part of a widening purge. By 1936, the greatest threat to Lepke's empire no longer came from rival gangs, but from men who might talk. Now his main target, Dutch Schultz, was dead. Special Prosecutor Thomas Dewey was closing in on the syndicate through the labor unions, and every whisper of cooperation was treated as a death sentence. The underworld was gripped by paranoia. Old associates became liabilities overnight. One such liability was Joseph Rosen. Rosen had once owned a small trucking business in Brownsville until Lepke's labor racketeering crushed it and forced him out. Now, stripped of his livelihood, he scraped by running a modest candy store located at 725 Sutter Avenue in Brooklyn. By the summer of 1936, Lepke became convinced, rightly or not, that Rosen was preparing to cooperate with Dewey. That suspicion alone was enough. The contract was issued through Mendy Weiss, with Harry assigned as backup. On the morning of September the 13th, 1936, the team went into position. Scotland Bernstein waited behind the wheel of the getaway car, whilst Abe Reles took his place at the door as a lookout. When Rosen entered his shop, Mendy Weiss went in first with Harry close behind. Inside the candy store, the execution was swift and merciless. Weiss fired 6 shots into Rosen's chest, killing him instantly. Then Harry stepped forward, and either out of impulse or indulgence, fired 4 more rounds into the lifeless body. They then fled cleanly. When Mendy Weiss later reported Harry's excess to Lepke, the boss showed no concern. Rosen was dead. The message had been delivered, and once again Harry had added his signature to another silenced informant, and now he was about to add it to an old associate. George Whitey Rudnick had been with Reles's original Brownsville Boys crew since the late 1920s. He was a lone shark, a hanger-on, and a hopeless drug addict, unstable, unreliable, and increasingly dangerous. By the spring of 1937, Harry became convinced that Rudnick had started talking to a detective. In their world, rumors alone were enough to earn a death sentence. Harry made it clear to the others a junkie with loose lips could sink them all, and the decision came quickly and without debate. Rudnick had to disappear. For 4 days they hunted him through Brooklyn streets, watching and waiting until they finally spotted him shuffling along a sidewalk, thin, dazed, and half lost in addiction. A bando pulled up beside him and offered him a ride. Rudnick climbed in without hesitation, unaware that he had just stepped into his own execution. A bando drove him to a garage at 2310 Atlantic Avenue, which is still a garage today, where Harry and Happy Owen were waiting. Inside, the mood turned instantly predatory. Abando grabbed Rudnick from behind, pinning his arms, while Harry slipped a clothesline over his head and pulled it tight until the life drained out of him. But even that wasn't enough. Stab wounds later found in Rudnick's chest showed that his heart, lungs, and liver had been slashed in a savage frenzy. When they tried to load the body into the car, they realized that he was too tall. So Abando bent the legs to force him inside, and the pressure pushed a burst of air from the lungs, creating a faint choking sound. In a flash of panic and rage, Harry believed Rudnick was still alive and began stabbing again and again and again, 63 times in all. Then, in a final grotesque gesture, Mayone lifted a meat cleaver and muttered, "Let me hit this bastard once for luck," before bringing it down hard and splitting Rudnick's skull in two. It was another message written in blood, not just for enemies on the outside, but for anyone on the inside who forgot what true loyalty meant. They dumped his body in the back of Abando's car, outside 1190 Jefferson Avenue in Bushwick, a mile away from the garage on Atlantic Avenue, but they had no time to enjoy the killing because just a few days later they again had to murder one of their own. And that man was Walter Sage. He'd been part of the Brownsville boys from the very beginning. A close friend of Harry and the trusted man who oversaw their slot machine operations in the Catskills. For a time, the two had even lived together in Brooklyn. Sage's right-hand man was Ganji Cohen, a steady presence who handled the books and enforced Sage's authority. But by the summer of 1937, the numbers stopped adding up. The gang's own tallies didn't match Sage's records. Money was missing. Excuses followed. And in that world, missing money meant only one thing. Harry decided Sage was stealing. And once Harry made a decision like that, there was no appeal. The execution was planned with the same careful precision Harry brought to every contract. Around July the 20th, Harry summoned Pretty Levine, who was vacationing nearby, and told him to pick him up at the Evans Hotel in Loch Sheldrake, located at 712 Hurleyville Road. The two men waited in Levine's car along a dark rural road until another vehicle approached and blinked its headlights, the signal. Inside was Sage, Cohen, and another young recruit from Brownsville, Jack Ducker. Sage sat amongst men he trusted, unaware that every face around him had already signed his death warrant. The car moved along the empty stretch of road. Harry made his move. He slipped an arm around Sage's neck and drove an ice pick into him again and again, more than 30 times in total. When it was over, blood filled the back seat, but Sage was still alive. Hearing Sage still whimpering, Harry used his signature final blow and tied a cord around Sage's feet and neck, meaning he too would have strangled himself to death. The killing shattered Ganji Cohen. Convinced he'd be next, he ran into the woods and vanished into the night, eventually fleeing to California, where he went into hiding. Harry and Jack Ducker transferred Sage's body into Levine's car and drove the 15-minute journey to Swan Lake in Liberty, Sullivan County, located along New York State Route 55. There they turned a pinball machine around the corpse and lashed heavy metal framing to it, trying to ensure that it would never surface. The body was dumped into the black water and left to disappear. But 10 days later, campers found it floating near the shore. The makeshift weights had failed, and trapped gases had lifted the corpse back to the surface. When word reached Harry, he didn't panic. He only smirked and muttered with his bum, "You gotta be a doctor or he floats." It was the kind of joke only a man completely desensitized to death could make, a reminder that for Harry, killing had long since become routine. By late 1937, Pittsburgh Phil was known throughout the underworld as a precise and relentless contract killer. But on November the 8th, death followed him outside the rules of syndicate violence. Driving through Brooklyn at Kings Highway and East 96th Street, Harry struck and killed 71-year-old Clara Nettleman as she crossed the street. There was no contract, no underworld motive, just a civilian life ended in an instant. For one of the first confirmed times in his long list of killings, a woman had become one of Harry's victims. The following day, Harry was booked on a homicide charge at the Empire Boulevard Police Station, located at 421 Empire Boulevard in Brooklyn, now the 71 Precinct. He calmly gave his occupation as a garage proprietor, living at 558 Sockman Street, masking a reputation the newspapers quickly exposed. To police and reporters alike, he was already a known racketeer with a long arrest record, a man repeatedly taken into custody but never convicted. Even in an accidental killing, the pattern remained the same. Death surrounded Harry. And once again, he seemed poised to slip through the cracks. But while one life ended on a Brooklyn street, another reckoning was already being arranged hundreds of miles away. That reckoning centered on Harry Millman, a violent fixture of Detroit's Purple Gang, who had long been a thorn in the side of the Italian Mafia. By late 1937, tensions finally exploded, fueled by Millman's growing interference in Mafia rackets and an alleged barroom beating of Scarface Joe Bomearito, a made man in the Detroit Mafia whose humiliation could not go unanswered. In Mafia tradition, a made man was a formerly initiated member, someone who had sworn lifelong loyalty during a secret ceremony in which blood was drawn. A holy card burned in his palm and an oath taken that bound him to the family forever. Such initiation conferred protection and status. Assaulting a made man without permission was viewed as an attack on the entire organization, a grave insult that demanded blood. Millman had crossed a line the syndicate never ignored. The first attempt on Millman's life came in August 1937, around 3:00 a.m. As he stepped out of the upscale 1040 Club, located at 1040 Wayne Street in Detroit, after an evening of dining and dancing. While Millman lingered outside waiting for his men, the club's valet, Willie Holmes, slid behind the wheel of Millman's Cadillac to start the engine. The moment Holmes turned the ignition, 7 to 10 sticks of dynamite wired to the spark plug detonated. The explosion ripped through the quiet street, shattering windows in surrounding buildings, setting off burglar alarms, and launching the Cadillac's hood onto the roof of a 5-story structure. Holmes was mortally wounded and died later that day. Millman, by sheer luck, emerged from the attempt completely unharmed. A narrow escape that only delayed the reckoning already closing in on him. The botched explosion only hardened the syndicate's resolve. After that failure, Mayone and Harry were dispatched to Detroit to finish the job properly. Millman's reckoning finally arrived on the night of November the 25th, 1937, at Boski's Restaurant and Delicatessen at 8900 12th Street and Hazelwood Avenue on Detroit's near west side. Shortly before 1:00 a.m., Millman approached the bar to order more drinks. Harry and Mayone, dressed in dark snap-brim hats and Tampolo coats, entered from the delicatessen without hesitation, and they approached Millman and opened fire with automatic pistols from point-blank range. Millman was killed instantly, collapsing to the floor before he could react. As patrons dove for cover, the gunman continued firing, wounding several others, including Millman's bodyguard, Harry Gross, and 2 innocent bystanders who were struck by stray bullets. Gross would die 2 weeks later. It was a public execution meant to be seen. The murder of Harry Millman showed just how far murderings reached now extended, and what happened to anyone who interfered with Mafia-controlled territory, no matter what city they ran in. By the summer of 1938, Harry had become more than just a weapon aimed at outsiders. He was now being used to clean house inside the syndicate itself. While vacationing in the Catskills that August, Harry received direct contact from Lepke. These mountains were more than a resort getaway for Jewish gangsters. They were a safe zone, a place where bookmakers, union racketeers, and hitmen mingled freely among vacationing families. Cabarets and bungalow colonies served dual roles: summer night life for tourists and discreet meeting spots for the underworld. The target this time was Hyman Uran, a high-ranking member of Lepke's own organization whose usefulness had run its course. Uran had been assigned to supervise rackets in the Catskills, but he had begun drinking heavily, flashing money, and talking too freely. In Lepke's world, that combination was deadly. On August the 21st, 1938, Uren had been vacationing at the Flagler Hotel, a prominent resort on Hotel Row along Route 42 in Falls, Sullivan County. Uren took a phone call, walked down to the front of the hotel, and got into his own automobile driven by a mysterious blonde woman. He was never seen alive again. He would later be killed by Harry, who shot him 3 times in the head. After the hit, Harry, Tick-Tock, Jack Ducker, and Skolin Bernstein transported Uren's body to the Browns Hotel construction site on Hurleyville Road, where a swimming pool was under excavation. There they buried him in a fresh pit near the foundation, concealing the murder beneath an ordinary construction project. The killing of Uren sent another chilling message through the underworld. Not even Lepke's inner circle was safe, and Harry was now the man trusted to carry out executions at the very highest levels of the syndicate. By 1939, as Thomas Dewey's investigation tightened its grip on the syndicate, even longtime insiders became liabilities. Whitey Friedman, a collector for Lepke, was arrested and released on bail. And in the paranoid world of organized crime, that alone was enough to sign his death warrant. Lepke became convinced that Friedman might talk, and once again, when silence had to be guaranteed, he turned to Pittsburgh Phil. As usual, the murder was planned with cold precision. Louis Capone supplied a shotgun and a pistol, both sawed off by a Brees and handed to Harry. Sawing off the barrels made the weapons far easier to conceal under coats, quicker to draw in tight spaces, and harder for a victim to grab or deflect at close range. The shortened barrels also widened the spread of the shot, ensuring maximum damage in a sudden street attack. Harry chose Blue Jaw Magoon to assist him. For days, they tracked Friedman through Manhattan and the subway, learning his routine. On the day of the hit, Harry and Blue Jaw followed him into Brooklyn. As Friedman walked down the street near his home at 22 East 96th Street in Brooklyn, Harry leaned out of the car, raised the sawed-off shotgun, and fired a single devastating blast that killed him instantly. The escape was as methodical as the kill. Harry and his crew drove to Lincoln Terrace Park on East New York Avenue in Brooklyn and discarded the shotgun. Blue Jaw hid the pistol beneath a rock in a vacant lot and retrieved it the following morning under the cover of a late-night outing. Another problem solved. It was the same familiar pattern, precise, ruthless, and engineered to leave as little behind as possible. And once again, Harry stood at the center of it. But the machinery of violence never paused, and by September 1939, a new target had already been selected. That target was Irving "Puggy" Feinstein, a former boxer turned betting operator in Borough Park, who operated from his headquarters at 46,021 13th Avenue. His operation sat squarely on territory claimed by Vincent Mangano, which stretched from Red Hook to Bensonhurst. Vincent Mangano, also known as Vincent the Executioner, was Albert Anastasia's boss and one of the bosses of the 5 New York Mafia families. Mangano viewed Feinstein as not just competition, but as an intrusion that could not be tolerated. The order moved quickly down the chain. Mangano contacted Albert Anastasia, and Anastasia passed the contract down without hesitation to the man he trusted most with delicate work, Pittsburgh Phil. For weeks, Harry and the crew searched the borers, unable to locate their target. The break came on September the 5th on a street corner in Brownsville. Harry was standing with Reles and Bugsy when a small pug-nosed man approached them, asking if they knew a local loan shark. Harry recognized him instantly. It was Puggy. Without alarm, they improvised. Bugsy offered to help him look for the man and drove him through the neighborhood, while Harry and Reles prepared the trap. Eventually, Bugsy steered Puggy into Reles's house at 649 East 91 Street. The moment Puggy stepped inside, Harry struck. A violent struggle erupted. Puggy bit down on Harry's finger, sending him into a rage. The crew tied him up and, with methodical brutality, strangled him with a clothesline. The body was dumped at a nearby refuse site in Cypress Hills and set on fire in an attempt to erase the evidence. The flames were seen. The fire was reported, but once again Harry walked away from the scene as he always had, with evidence destroyed and confidence high. However, by the end of 1939, That confidence was about to meet its reckoning. For years, Harry Reles and Murder Incorporated had operated with near total impunity across Brooklyn and beyond, leaving bodies in alleys, dumps, basements, and lakes, while police ran into the same walls over and over again. Fear, silence, and missing witnesses. But the tide was finally beginning to turn. Less than 4 months after the murder of Puggy, a new Brooklyn District Attorney, John J. Bennett, Jr., took office. A methodical prosecutor with no appetite for underworld compromise, Bennett immediately set his sights on the syndicate of killers that had mocked the justice system for nearly a decade. Bennett understood that murdering could not be broken from the outside. It would have to be cracked from within. To do that, he turned to a young, relentless assistant district attorney named Burton Turkis, assigning him to untangle more than 200 unsolved murders tied to the gang. The strategy was simple and dangerous: relentless pressure, plea deals for cooperators, and absolute protection for anyone willing to talk. It was the first time the system openly challenged the gang on its own terms. The investigation exploded into motion on January the 2nd, 1940, when Reles, Sol Goldstein, and Duke Mafia were arrested for the murder of Red Alpert, based largely on information supplied by a troubled petty criminal of whom no photos survived, named Harry Rudolph, who had been sitting in jail as a material witness. Rudolph had quietly passed a note to prosecutors, claiming that he had knowledge of the Alpert killing and other Brownsville murders, a gesture that, despite his reputation for instability, was enough to jolt investigators into action. His lead opened the first crack in the Brownsville wall of silence, giving the district attorney grounds to begin hauling in suspects. 2 weeks later, the net tightened further, when Harry, Mayone, and Abendondo were taken into custody as well. Rudolph's note turned out to be the loose thread that unraveled the most feared killing machine in America. After the arrest of Reles, Goldstein, and Mafia, prosecutors began pressing each man relentlessly. The first to crack was Mafia, who realized that the DA's office finally had enough leverage and enough names to make life very difficult for anyone who wanted to stay loyal. Faced with the possibility of the electric chair, and with no help coming from above, Mafia began offering details about the Alpert killing and hinting at the wider web of contract murders carried out at the behest of Lepke Buchter's organization. His cooperation was cautious at first, but it was exactly the signal that investigators needed. With Mafia talking, attention shifted immediately to Reles. Detectives and prosecutors recognized instantly that if Reles could be flipped, the entire structure of Murder Incorporated, the killers, the contracts, the chain of command, it could all fall in a matter of months. Reles resisted hard at the start, but as the evidence mounted, an isolation set in. He made the fateful decision that would reshape organized crime history. Abius agreed to cooperate. Once he began talking, he did not hold back. Burton Turkis later said that Reles enjoyed bragging about the murders. He systematically laid out names, dates, motives, methods, and the internal hierarchy of the killing squad, tying street murders directly to Lepke's labor racket empire. Acting on information from Reles, detectives found 7 bodies of victims of Murder Incorporated, including the remains of Hyman Urin, who had been killed by Harry and Locke Sheldrake the year before. From there, the dominoes fell quickly. Reles's testimony implicated Louis Capone, Harry the Dasher Rabendo, Bugsy Goldstein, Happy Mayone, Louis Lepke himself, and countless lesser enforcers, providing prosecutors with the clearest roadmap they had ever possessed of the syndicate's inner workings. For the first time, high-ranking racketeers like Lepke faced capital charges based on the testimony of their own hitmen. As Reles talked, panic spread through the remaining ranks. While Harry awaited trial behind prison walls, another detail emerged that strengthened the case tightening around him. A woman claiming to be his sister, Eva, made repeated visits to the jail. The authorities grew suspicious. During one visit, her deception was exposed. She was not his sister at all, but she was Evelyn, the infamous kiss of death girl. She arrived wearing 3 diamond rings which she claimed Harry had given her, and that detail struck hard. It matched Reles's earlier testimony about the robbery of Red Alpert, the young jewel thief whose stolen diamonds had been taken by the Brownsville crew before he was murdered. Now those same stones, or what appeared to be them, were glittering on Evelyn's fingers. The walls were closing in on Harry from every direction. Realizing her value, prosecutors set Evelyn's bail at $50,000, holding her as a potential witness despite her protests. She knew too much, not only about Harry, but about the money, the murders, and the men still clinging to freedom from inside custody. She spoke openly about the wave of betrayals ripping through the gang, remarking that Kid Twist had done the smart thing by talking first and hinting that Harry should do the same. And Harry, the man who had once laughed at death, now wavered. Word spread that he was willing to cooperate, too, but only if it guaranteed his own survival. Loyalty was gone. Fear had replaced it. And one by one, the killers of murdering began turning on each other, feeding the legal machine with confessions, names, and bodies. The group that had once ruled through silence was now being destroyed by voices of its strongest soldiers, each one scrambling to save their own skin. What began as a cryptic note from a small-time hoodlum in a jail cell had become the catalyst for the total collapse of Murder Incorporated. The first trial to emerge from Reles's revelations involved Mayan and Abendando, charged with the 1937 brutal murder of Whitey Rudnick in Brooklyn. Harry was also indicted in connection with the killing. In the courtroom, District Attorney William O'Dwyer spoke with cold certainty as he laid out the case before the grand jury and the press. He described Harry as the most vicious killer in the Brooklyn syndicate, a career assassin who carried out most of the slayings, sometimes just to deliver the final blow. Odo made it clear that, in the final years of Murder Incorporated, Harry and Mayone had become even more ruthless than Reles, the former leader whose betrayal now fueled the prosecutions. With pressure mounting and testimony closing in from every direction, Harry made the fateful decision to cooperate with the district attorney's office. The move triggered a quiet but decisive shift in the courtroom. The judge granted a severance, formally removing Harry from the group indictment so the jury would never see him flip. Court officers escorted him out a side door, not back to the holding cells, but into the custody of the DA's own protective detail, where he was kept isolated from the other defendants. His case was placed on administrative pools, the charges still hanging over him while prosecutors evaluated what he could offer. But the maneuver brought him no real escape. His crimes were too many, too brutal, and too well documented. Even out of the courtroom, the inevitable sentence still awaited him. Even as he spoke, the shadow of the electric chair continued to loom. As Harry awaited trial in Brooklyn City Prison, he began faking signs of insanity, hoping to manipulate the court in a final act to try and escape his inevitable fate. Guards and fellow inmates reported that he would pace relentlessly in his cell, muttering to himself in fragmented, almost nonsensical phrases, occasionally laughing or cursing under his breath for no apparent reason. At times he would stare blankly at the walls for hours, rocking slightly, or scribbling incoherent lines on scraps of paper, giving the impression of a man unraveling at the edges. By September 1940, even his appearance became part of the legal battle. Harry had grown a heavy, unkempt beard, which back then was considered to be a sign of insanity. Prosecutors argued it was another calculated move, a disguise meant to confuse witnesses and soften